Hello, my name is Shamini. You may also know me as Shaw, and I'm going to explain how to shoot in manual, how to use your fancy camera. So I'm a professional photographer. I've been working as a professional photographer for almost 10 years, and from day one I started shooting with one of these big DSLR cameras. And you'll notice that right on the top there's always this dial that has like a flower and a mountain and the letter M and the letter A and the letter P and the letter C. What do you shoot on? That's like the first thing to adjust. And I tell you from day one, put it on the M. M means manual. It means that you as the user are going to be choosing what your settings are for the camera. Those other settings, just pretend they don't exist. For 10 years, I've never used any of them. I only use manual. Shooting in manual is confusing for people to get their head wrapped around it. Usually they're like, well, if I put it on one of these other settings, I can just start taking pictures right away. If I set it in manual, then my pictures are all too dark or too bright, or they're blurry, like I can't make it work and I just want to take photos. So you're eager and impatient to start taking photos, so you use one of these other settings, and what happens is it becomes a crutch and you stay on that setting forever. My dad has been shooting on one of these settings for years and years and years, and I'm trying to get him to move over to manual. My brother just started taking photos a year ago or so, and from day one I jumped on it and was like, learn manual. And he will tell you, just like everybody else, that once you learn manual, you never go back. At least nobody I know. So what is manual? Really, you only have to think about 3 settings. When you're shooting in manual, you're thinking about shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. There are other settings on the camera. There's white balance, there's focal points. You don't need to worry about those. Not right now. And when we're talking about manual shooting, those 3 settings, shutter speed, ISO, aperture, are what are going to determine what your photo looks like in the end. It's where you get to control the camera so that the photo looks good, and it's where you can put your own little fingerprint, your own little twist on it, so that the photo starts to have your style in particular. Because there's never a right or a wrong setting. So you could have 2, 3 professional photographers take a photograph of the same moment, and we would all have slightly different settings on our camera depending on the look that we're going for. Also, the way that the photos look in the end is highly determined by the editing work that happens in post-processing. So step 1 is getting it in camera. The better your photo is in camera, the easier it's going to be to edit it and deliver a good photo. You do not want to be in a situation where you're taking a bad photo and then you're trying to fix it in editing. So by learning manual, you are taking a lot of control into your own hands to ensure that the photos you're taking are the quality and the style that you want. When I teach people how to shoot in manual, those 3 settings, shutter, aperture, and ISO, I compare it to the human eyeball. The human eyeball is a tool for seeing images. The camera is a tool for seeing images. The images that you see with your eyeball are stored in your brain. The images that you see with your camera are stored on your card. Okay? Memory card, memory brain. So, the way that the human eye works is very similar to the way that the camera works, and this is how I break it down. Shutter speed is comparable to the eyelid. The shutter is like an eyelid inside the camera. When you take a picture, you'll see, do you see it blink? Watch the camera blink. It's like it's going blink, 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 blink. It's all about light, right? So if we turn off the lights and it's black, you can't see anything. You also cannot take a picture. So eyes and cameras are tools for seeing things in light. When you see something, the light is traveling, the light waves are traveling through the air and they enter into your eyeball. The light waves travel through the air and they enter into the eyeball of the camera, the lens of the camera. If the shutter is closed, the eye is closed, eye is open, shutter is open, how quickly are you blinking? Okay? So if the shutter stays open, if the eyeball stays open for a long time, a lot of light is streaming in, like a crazy person. Just like, I see so much light. How much light is getting memorized in my brain? I saw so much. So much was saved to the memory. If I have my eyes closed and I just open them for a quick second, quickly open, not that much light can travel in, not that much scenery goes into the memory bank. You're not really seeing that much because there's only just a hot second of exposure. So blinking speed determines how much you see. And it's like whether it's a quick shot of the moment or whether it's like a long, we call it a long exposure. You're holding your eyes open, you're holding your camera open for a long time, which means a lot of light is going to come in. So if the shutter speed is greater or smaller, it's all measured in numbers, right? So shutter speed is fractions of seconds. So if you're looking at the numbers on the top of your camera and you see the shutter speed and it says 1, it's like 1 second, your camera is going to keep its eyes open for 1 second. So it's going to get 1 second worth of light. Whatever it sees happening during that 1 second, it will record it and it will record it all. As you make the blink, the shutter fire faster, it's going to see half a second, a quarter of a second. Now we're getting just into these milliseconds and it's only going to capture just like a split motion in time. Let me give you some specific examples. If you're photographing someone running and the person is running and you quickly open your eyes, you quickly open the shutter and close it, you're only going to see that person's running for 1 moment. Just they're going to get caught in slow motion, not slow motion, still frame. You're going to catch them and they're going to be frozen still because the shutter was so fast, it just caught that 1 moment. If you hold the camera shutter open for a long time, then your camera is going to see the person running and running and running, and then when you look at the photo, you're going to see a person blurry, 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 blurry. There's going to be a person and there's going to be a blurry ghost behind them, a trail behind them, because the camera was watching and collecting all of that image the whole time it happened. So whenever you're taking a picture of something that's really fast, sports, cars, babies running around, anything fast, you want it to be a fast, quick shutter, which means that fraction, that number is smaller, 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 smaller fraction. If you are trying to take pictures in the dark, like there's not as much light, or if you want to capture something that's happening very slowly, then keeping that shutter open longer, holding the eyes of the camera open for longer, allows more light to travel in. So if you're trying to photograph something in a dark room, like a night sky, you're trying to photograph the stars, the shutter can stay open for multiple minutes. Your camera is open for multiple minutes collecting data, and when you see the photo, the final photo will have tons of blur, or the like the night sky you'll actually be able to see so many stars because the camera was collecting the light as it traveled for 8 billion miles. Until it actually showed up. Okay, so that's the basic concept behind the shutter. And you can see how, one, that is influencing the quality of the photo, whether you're getting enough light or not, and whether things are clear or blurry. And it also gives you a little tiny bit of play for style. Are you wanting it to be blurry? Are you wanting to take in more light? Are you wanting to be more crisp? Second setting is aperture. Aperture is the opening, how wide open the lens is. Similar to the human eyeball, it's to the pupil. In a very dark room, your pupil will get really big, trying to make a tunnel as big as possible for that light to travel through. Like, give me as much light as I possibly can. And then when it gets super duper bright outside, the sun comes out, your pupils get really tiny, and you're like, it's so bright, I'm only gonna let this tiny little amount come through. Camera does the same thing. In a really dark room, in a dark setting, you wanna open up your aperture. Open up the hole inside the lens as wide as it can go. So inside of a lens, it's a ring of like plastic and glass, and it rotates like this, where it's closed and tiny, and then it rolls open and gets bigger, and then it closes up again, and then it gets bigger, right? You can see my lips, ooh, tiny, big. Do you see the point? As it rolls around in a circle, the hole opens and closes. So this is a small, tiny aperture. This is what you'd shoot in if it's super bright outside. You're trying to take pictures of somebody at the beach. The sun is blaring. It's so bright. So you're making this tiny, tiny hole. And then the sun goes behind the clouds and it starts to get dark. You're going to open up the lens of the camera so that more sunshine can come through. Something interesting happens when we change the aperture. When the hole is really tiny, it changes the depth of field. It's very different depth of field when it's open like this. What is depth of field? Depth of field is how blurry is the background. When you look at the photo, is there one thing that's in focus, like a person's face is in focus, clear, you can see it, and everything else behind them is blurry. You cannot see it, or it's just kind of like really artistic and fuzzy back there. Or when you look at the photo, is everything clear? You can see the face, you can see the body, you can see the trees, you can see the house, everything is crisp. It's like, whoa, real, there's no depth to it. It's like everything is just vivid. Because what happens with the human eye is when you're looking at something, when you're focusing on me, like you're watching a video of me, so everything else in your peripheral vision right now is blurry. There's depth in your life. It's 3D. You're focused on one thing and everything else is blurry. If you saw me clearly and everything else in the room was also clear, think of like, that's pretty intense. It also kind of feels a little bit like there's not as much beautiful depth happening. So aperture, not only does it control how much light is coming in, the photo will be really bright, the photo will be really dark, it also, the change of the lens like that affects the depth of field. So when it's open, big aperture, letting in a lot of light, open like this is what gives you the blurry background. Closed like this makes the photo darker, and it brings everything else into focus. And it's all incremental. So the wider you get, the blurrier the background gets, the brighter the photo gets, more and more and more, and then less and less and less and less and less and less. So for an example, if you're taking a portrait, like a senior portrait of a teenager, or a wedding portrait, and you want this to be an exquisite, beautiful portrait that is focused on this person's face, and the background is just kind of creamy and smooth, you want to shoot with that aperture as wide open as possible. Focus on their face, everything else is going to be creamy. And there's going to be tons of beautiful light coming in, so it really like glows. If we are now going to photograph, let's say we're at that wedding, right? We're now going to photograph a group of people. There's like 20 people, and they're standing in line from like shortest to tallest in the back, and you've got like 3 rows of people. If your aperture is wide and big like this, you're going to focus on the group, and only one person is going to be in focus. Everyone else will be blurry because of that depth of field. Everybody else is falling into the background, even if they're only like 1 foot away from each other. That's how sensitive the camera can be. It can realize that you're focused on this one. Like if the camera's over here, the camera will be like, oh, we're focusing on her nose, and her ears will be blurry. But if we make the aperture smaller again, then the camera will say, oh, we'll make sure we can see all of this, the nose and the ears, the people in the front row and the people in the back row. So if I have a group of people and I'm trying to get everybody clear, the aperture needs to go down smaller, which of course means that it's also going to get darker. You gotta keep that in mind. The third setting is ISO. Now, disclaimer, I do not know with confidence if my metaphor holds up here. Someone who understands human biology and cameras might dispute what I'm about to say, but go with me for a moment. This is how I think about it. ISO is in the back of the camera. That's like back here. It's not to do with this lens, it's to do with how sensitive the camera itself is to light that's coming in. So how much light you're letting in through the lens, depending on how open the shutter is, how open the aperture is, whatever light you allowed in travels back here into the camera body. And then the question is, will the camera body see that light? And how sensitive will it be? How much detail will it pick up of the light data that came in? For the human eye, I think of there's the pupil and there's the eyelid up here. But if we move back into the skull, the back of the eye has these rods and cones, these sensors for picking up that light has come through, and they're like, oh, there's light out there. We'll process what this light means and send signals to the brain, the memory. If I were to have something tragic happen to my eyesight, let's say that the rods and the cones are destroyed or something, then I might have my eyes wide open and all this light is coming in through the pupils, but the rods and the cones in the back are not receiving that light signal. So essentially I'm blind. So you have to have a sensitivity to the light to be able to see it and capture it. If the rods and cones get weaker and weaker and they're less sensitive, they're losing their touch, they're getting a little bit weak. They, instead of picking up a huge array of all the different light colors in the spectrum, they're only able to pick up a limited amount, so less sensitive. Same thing with the camera. Less expensive camera, like a beginning camera, is going to be less sensitive. The more you invest in your camera, the higher quality the equipment is, the fancier your ISO, it gets wider, it can see more. It's like, how many colors can the human eye see? Can you see only 6 colors? Or can you see 6 million? Are there actually 6 billion, but you're not sensitive enough to see a lot of those? Same thing with the camera. Your camera has a certain range of light that it's able to see, how sensitive it is. If you're taking a lot of pictures in the dark, like you photograph weddings or something, and the wedding parties happen at night, it'll behoove you to invest in a camera that has a very wide spectrum of light sensitivity, so that you can take pictures of the light on the edges that are getting missed by the cheaper cameras, which are only capturing the brightest light because they're not that sensitive. It's like when someone's deaf or blind, like something has to be really big for them to see it, really loud for them to hear it. If your camera has really high quality vision, high ISOs, your camera, the better vision your camera has, the higher your ISO will go. So some cameras, entry level, may only go up to like 1,000 or 2,000. My camera is pretty awesome. It goes up to like 6,000, 7,000 ISO. Now, something to keep in mind is that the ISO does equate to the crispness or the graininess, the noisiness of a photo. So if you're looking at a photo that was taken in the middle of the day and the ISO is turned down lower, because it doesn't need to be as sensitive in the middle of the day, there's lots of light, most cameras will do just fine. The photo will just look like a clear digital photo. As the light gets dimmer and darker into the evening, the cheaper cameras will not be sensitive to pick up anything. It'll just look like blackness. The cameras that have higher quality, bigger ISO ranges, they're going to be able to continue to see in the dark, but it will look really grainy. It'll look really like almost fuzzy, or like there's dots all over the camera. It'll just look like really, really bad quality photo. But at least you got a photo versus just completely black. So that's why, as something like a wedding photographer, you would want to have a camera that can do that, so that in the worst case scenario, if your flash wasn't working, if there was no lights, if you're not allowed to use a flash, and they're getting married at midnight, then your camera can shoot in the dark. And I've actually done that a lot. I've been at a lot of weddings where I just use my highest ISO, and the picture quality is a little bit less, but I didn't have to disturb the whole party with a big flash going off. Yeah. So, all three of those settings, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, have to do with how bright or dark the photo is, what the exposure is. When the shutter is open for a longer amount of time, more light comes in. When it's a faster shutter, less light comes in. Aperture, when it's bigger, more light comes in. When it's smaller, less light comes in. ISO, when it's a wider, bigger range of sensitivity, more light comes in if you crank it up. And if it's got a smaller range, it can only handle a little bit of range, and it's going to be only like the brightest light, can't handle any dark situations. As you turn up the ISO, the photo will get brighter. As you open up the aperture, the photo will get brighter. Now this is where it gets confusing. If you turn up the shutter speed, it gets darker. This is where people get confused, because it's not just like everything turns up and it gets brighter. It's a little bit of math. You turn up the ISO, it'll get brighter, because that's sensitivity. It's becoming more sensitive. You turn, even though you're opening up the aperture, you are actually making the number smaller. You're opening up the shutter and you're making the number smaller because it's a ratio, it's a fraction. So, the smaller the number, the smaller this, damn it, this is why people get confused with manual. It's as soon as we start to talk about it with these numbers and these ratios. What I said before, I feel is easier to understand. Where you're going to get tripped up and where I'm getting tripped up and explaining it, because I don't even really think about it that much, and often I find math somewhat confusing. So it's just when you're looking on the screen of your camera, the numbers might not always make sense at the beginning. You're looking at fractions, and you're looking at like 1.8, and then you've got something else that's like 100, 1,000, you're like, what? So the easiest one, and I'll say this clearly this time, the easiest one is ISO, because there's not fractions, it's just a number. ISO 100, ISO 500, ISO 1000, ISO 2000. Each time it gets bigger, it's getting brighter, it's getting more sensitive. Easy, couldn't get easier than that. Okay, now we look at, I already told you the fractions of the shutter speed, right? It's a 1 second, 2 seconds, half a second, a quarter of a second. So you're getting smaller fractions, faster speeds of time. Faster it is, the darker the photo. So as you increase the number in size, the photo will get brighter. The aperture, we talk about that as, you'll see the letter F, and then 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, 2.8, 2.4, 4, 4, 5, 7, 8, 12, whatever. If you're shooting up into 20, the higher that number goes, the darker the picture gets. And that's where you get confused, because the aperture is the only one where if you're increasing that number, it's getting darker and smaller. So you just think the aperture is the backwards one, where you want that number to be as small as possible to get the light huge, to get the eyeball pupil huge, so tons of light can come in and you get that creamy background depth of field that you get when it's huge. This huge aperture, this huge pupil happens when the number is very small, because it's also fraction. It's the size of the diameter of the opening. Okay. That's how all the individual settings work. Then it's the interplay between each of them where you get to be creative and add your own signature and dial in exactly the exposure that you want for your image. So if you at all understand music and mixing, it's like mixing different levels. You're gonna make the drums louder, the guitar louder, the vocals quieter, like you're mixing levels like that. It's kind of like that with the camera settings. So you've got ISO, aperture, and the shutter speed, aperture, ISO. That's how I think about it. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO. And when you're going to take a picture, the best way I can explain this is kind of my approach or my mindset. I show up to photograph kids, which is my specialty. So I've got a kid running around in front of me, and I look at the light, and I think to myself, it's a super bright, good quality light day. I'm not thinking it's too dark, it's not too bright, it's just nice overcast Seattle day. And I think first to myself, this child is going to look most beautiful with an aperture that's big and wide open, so the background is blurry. But this child is running around a lot. So it's going to be difficult for me to make sure that I focus on them, because the minute I focus on them, they might run off again. And yeah, so what are we going to do in this situation? I would say, well, because I want that creamy background, let's make the aperture as wide as we can go. So that number is going to be as small as possible. So like 1.8 or 2. By doing that, I've now got this beautiful creamy background, but I've opened up the aperture so much that so much light is coming through that pupil that the photo's all white. It's too bright. So then the second thing I'll adjust is the shutter speed. And I'm like, okay, we've got a child who's running around quickly, and I don't want them to be blurry. I want the photos to be really sharp. So let's take the shutter speed and increase it, make it really fast. By making the shutter speed really fast, it's going to make the blinking of the camera happen really quick, which will make sure that the child is not blurry. The child is caught in still motion, in a freeze frame. And by making it blink faster, less light is coming in the camera, so that it will be darker. So that will compensate for the fact that the big pupil, the big aperture, was letting in so much light. So now the photo is looking probably more even because the aperture made it really bright and then the shutter made it darker. And then I'll think, is it possible to have the ISO as low as possible? I'm always wanting it to be pretty low, like 100 to 400 is the ideal range for my ISO. If I put it in that range, the photo should look great on an average day in the middle of the day. If I were to have the ISO go higher than 400, it's probably going to be way too bright because that's just adding sensitivity. It's just adding more light that we were fine. So let's say I'm at this photo shoot with this kid, and we've been taking photos all afternoon, and now the sun is about to go down. So it's getting darker. I don't want to change my aperture. I like having it kind of blurry and dreamy and pretty. I don't want to change my shutter speed because the kid is still running around, but it is getting darker. And so that's where I would increase the ISO. I would say, like, let's let a little bit more light be picked up by the camera. However, let's say it gets so dark, it's not totally dark, it's like twilight. And the ISO now, I've had to crank the ISO up to like over 1,000 and to keep the photo looking good. At which point, the quality of the photo will now start to be decreasing. It'll start to look a little grainy and a little fuzzy, and I'm like, I don't want that. And it's not nighttime yet, it's not some wedding, and I don't want to use a flash, we're still playing outside with kids. So I'm not gonna raise my ISO any higher, I'm gonna cap it. I'm gonna say no higher than 1,000 today. I can bring more light into the camera by slowing down the shutter speed a little bit. Doesn't take much. Maybe the kid's starting to get a little tired, so they're not running around as fast, so I can get away with turning the shutter speed down, having the eyes stay open, the lens stay open a little bit longer, and allowing more light to come in. And maybe I just have like 1 or 2 more integers. The aperture, maybe I've got like 1 more setting. I could just make it like a little bit wider. And that combination, a little higher ISO, a little wider aperture, and a little bit longer shutter speed, is letting in more light so that I can still take pictures in this dark setting. And so then that's how I interplay with the 3 different settings, and that's the thought process that goes through my mind in every situation. Now, it's just this constant tweaking, like, oh, it's getting a little too dark, oh, it's getting a little too blurry, oh, it's getting a little too this. And that's why the manual is so powerful, because you're able to not only get the right amount of light coming in the camera, but you're also able to determine how blurry will the background be, how much grain will I have in the photo, how much blur do I want to allow, because sometimes that's beautiful. And if you have different amounts of ISO, that can actually give you a different quality, like the photo can look hazier or dreamier or glowier, and that's all more advanced stuff that you can get into, but that's available to you if you learn how to use manual. If you're shooting in one of these other settings, it's like driving an automatic versus driving a stick shift. If you put your camera in automatic, you're just taking pictures and you're like, well, I got what I got. If you put your camera in manual, then you're driving a manual, driving a stick shift, driving like a car, right? Where you can feel the car and you're like, ooh, I want to like transition at this moment. Ooh, I want to speed up. Ooh, I want to really like navigate the road with more control. I've heard that some people drive in that same fashion with an automatic. You learn how to listen to the engine and to drive with the automatic kind of similarly to the way you drive with the manual. So maybe there's somebody out there that can do that with a camera too. I don't know. Oh. Okay, I think that's enough information for right now. I'm sure there's a billion questions, and I would love to record another video to help answer those. So please feel free to leave those down below, and you can subscribe if you have a desire to get more videos from me. And if you'd like to be photographed by me, you can go to either of my websites, thehappyfilmcompany.com if you are a family and you want me to photograph your kids and you with your kids playing, or if you are an artist or entrepreneur, or you have a creative business and you would like me to take some photos and videos for you for your brand, then you can go to chamonixfilms.com. It's the exact same thing. I'm the same person. I take the same style of photos and videos. It's just, what am I photographing? People in their personal life or people in their work life? Yeah, I've had you guys asking a long time to learn how to shoot in manual. So I hope that this is the beginning of helping you get started using your DSLR. I hope it helps you feel just a little bit more clear on how this machine works. And I hope you have a great day.